Come to business law, and today in our introductory lecture we are going to learn about the meaning and definition of law. Right, before we go any further, you need to understand that law is actually the foundation upon which an organized society operates. So now every individual, business organization, government institutions, in operational uh, operates within what a legal framework. For accountants and business professionals, knowledge of law is very much important. Why? Because business transactions, employment relationships, contracts, companies, taxation, banking, and financial reporting are all affected by what? By legal rules. Right. So now this syllabus introduces you students to the essential elements of the Zambian legal system. All right. So it will begin with the nature and meaning of law. So now let me just run through with you our objectives for this lecture. So by the end of this lecture, you are the students who are expected, to define law, to explain the meaning of law from different legal, perspectives. You must be able to explain the nature and characteristics of law. You must be able to explain the purpose and functions of law. You must be able to distinguish law from morality and social rules. Then you must be able to explain the meaning of business law, and you also must be able to explain the importance of law to business and accountants. And lastly, you must be able to apply the concepts of law to practical business situations. Let's start by looking at the meaning of law. What is law? So now, the word law refers to a system of rules and principles that regulates the conduct of individuals, organizations, and institutions within a society. That's the meaning of the word law. So now, in simple terms, what does law mean? So law is simply defined as what? As a set of rules recognized and enforced by the state to regulate behavior and relationships in the society. So now, what does law determine? So law determines what people may do. Law determines what people must do. Law determines what people must not do. Then law also determines, the rights people have, the rights that people have. The law also determines the duties people owe to others and the consequences of violating legal rules. An example that can be given that if a business enters into a valid contract to supply goods, so now the law may require the parties to do what? To honor their contractual obligations. No one should violate it. So if one part breaches the contract, now what happens? The injured part may actually seek a legal remedy that is in the court. Right, so let's look at the definitions of law by legal scholars. So now, different legal scholars have actually defined law in different ways. And it's very important for you as students to do what? To understand all these definitions. Why? Because this will help you appreciate that law is actually a complex concept. Let's look at the definition of law according to John Austin's. So now, John Austin is associated with the command theory of law. So he has a famous proposition. So he defined it as a command of the sovereign. So John Austin defined law as the command of the sovereign. So now, what does this mean? So it means that law consists of commands that are issued by a sovereign authority and backed by what? By sanctions. Now, let's just try to understand the key words in this definition. So, Austin's theory contains three important elements. That theory that Austin, came up with, which says law is the command of the sovereign. So law is the command of the sovereign. In this definition or in this theory of John Austin or Austin, there are three important elements, of which the first one is command. Command means what? An authoritative order. The second key element is sovereign. Sovereign here means the supreme political authority. Then we also have another word that is sanction in the same theory. So sanction means a consequence for disobedience. An example that can be given that if legislation requires businesses to do what? To comply with a particular legal requirement. So failure to comply actually may do what? May result in a fine or another legally prescribed penalty. So that's why it's very important that everyone should do what? Should comply. Right, now let's look at the limitation of Austin's definition. The definition of Austin, seems and sounds to be very good and excellent, but then it has got certain limitations. So Austin's definition is influential but does not completely explain modern legal systems. So now, when you look at the modern law includes constitutional principles, judicial decisions, customary law, and other rules that cannot easily be described simply as commands of a sovereign. Right, so now we also have another definition that is according to Salmon's. So now Salmon's definition of law, he says or he states that law is actually the board of principles recognized and applied by the state in the administration of justice. That's how Salmon's define, the law. So what the law according to Salmon's? So according to Salmon, law is simply the board of principles recognized and applied by who? By the state. In the what? In the administration of what? In the administration of the justice. Right, so now let's try to break it down so that we really understand it in full extent. So now this definition makes emphasis on what? Legal principles. It makes emphasis on recognition by the state, meaning that in that definition, the law must be, consist of principles, legal principles that are legally recognized. Then number two, those legal principles must be recognized by the state. Okay, then those principles must be applied by the courts and then administration of justice. So the definition of law according to Salmon's, makes emphasis on legal principles, recognition by the state, application by courts, and administration of justice. So now, under this approach, we see that law is closely connected with what? With the institutions responsible for administering justice. Okay? Now let's look at the definition that is associated with Roscoe Pound. So now Roscoe Pound viewed law from a social perspective and emphasized its role in what? In balancing competing interests in society. So now his approach is actually associated with the what? With the idea of law as what? As a means of social control and social engineering. So the definition of a law according to Roscoe, he looks at law as a means of what? Social control, as a way on how we can control social aspects and also social engineering. So in other words, this simply means that law helps society organize, competing interests and maintain an orderly social environment. For example, employment legislation attempts to balance the interests of what? Employers, employees, the state, and what? And the wider economy.